Right, what is up, my push peeps? Happy week 16 to you. Happy Monday, hopefully Monday, in which you're watching our video. This is our last one of the semester for a full week's worth of instruction. I plan on providing one more brief video Monday just to wrap up some of the points that we're going to be unable to get to during our live session this week. But in terms of live weeks of instruction, this is the last one you got, so make sure you put all your effort into it. Next week, you'll have quite simply a brief, probably 25-30-minute video on Monday, wrapping up the end of Reconstruction and how it falls apart, as well as then your final, which we'll take in our live sessions. So you can have an experience with a little bit of timed assessment. So for today, we're going to introduce the idea of Reconstruction, what to do, how to put the country back together when obviously torn apart via civil war. And I don't mean just back together politically, but also economically and socially. There's a lot of questions that need answering at the conclusion of the Civil War. We covered some of those questions, some of those what remained unsettled in the Civil War at the tail end of our live session this past week. But first, I want you to think on this quote from a great American author named Herman Melville, in which he says, "The years of war tried, meaning tested, tried our devotion, our commitment to the Union. But the time of peace may test the sincerity of our faith in democracy." So the first thing I have in your handout is just a question for you to consider, right? In what ways do the questions lingering from the Civil War that carry into Reconstruction, in what ways do those questions and the answers to them test how much we actually believe in democracy or not as a nation? So I think the quote here provides some good thinking about the 1860s and 70s, obviously, but also for our time today. So it's a good quote worth thinking as we get into the real questions ahead of the nation for Reconstruction. So today we're going to just give a broad overview of the goals of Reconstruction, the strategies of Reconstruction, how Reconstruction breeds political conflict, not just between North and South, but between the presidency, the executive branch, and the legislative branch, as well as Democrats and Republicans. And we'll get into just the first brief couple years of Reconstruction in which President Andrew Johnson is in charge. First, we have to go back to really just rewind real quick to the tail end of the Civil War. Lincoln's second inaugural address when he's reelected in 1864, as you probably recall, heavily influenced by events of the war, the siege and burning of Atlanta, for example, and Sherman's march to the sea. Lincoln's reelected in an electoral college landslide, giving him a second term that, of course, he will not finish because he's assassinated shortly after the conclusion of the war. But in 1865, he gives his second inaugural address. And in it, he lays out, and it was in your live lesson text last week, so go back and reference the text if you'd like. It's a helpful one. But in his speech, he lays out his plan for Reconstruction, right? His plan for how to put the country back together as the war winds down. And in his speech, he promises a plan that includes his words: malice towards none and charity for all. Malice towards none and charity for all, which is an important line because it demonstrates Lincoln's long-time philosophy and belief in union above all, right? And the most important thing is keeping the country together. So he doesn't really believe in a Reconstruction plan that's going to punish the South necessarily, but hatred, malice towards none, charity, or accepting of all. But the Constitution does not give guidelines on how to do this, right? How do you readmit states to the Union that tried to leave, right? We know how to admit states, right? That's usually a Congress decision, right? Congress is a vote on the acceptance of states or not. But how do you readmit states there? Is that a Congress thing? Is that a presidential thing? Like who's got the power? So the president, both presidents that are going to be here discussed today, Lincoln as well as his successor Johnson, are going to disagree with Congress over how to treat southern states, as both presidents are going to take a more lenient approach to the South, while Republicans and radical Republicans in Congress are going to take a much more aggressive approach to the South. So that's what we have ahead of us for this week. But worth noting as we begin is how much the power of the central federal government expanded during the Civil War. Now, this is always true during wartime. Always true during wartime, in that the powers of the federal government expand to meet the needs of the war. The Civil War is especially noteworthy. And especially noteworthy because the South is gone, right? So the South doesn't have representatives in the House of Representatives. They don't have representatives in the Senate. Like the Southern perspective is out of the government for 4 years, right? Out of the government for 4 years, which leaves only Northern voices and largely Republican voices, because the South is where the predominant majority of Democrats at the time are located. So as you know, like party systems make a difference here. And the Republican Party believes in a loose interpretation, expansion of federal government power, government-funded infrastructure, right? Pro-industry, all those things that we know Republicans believe in a third-party system, much like the Whigs before them in the 1820s, 30s, and 40s. Now the Republicans have much more ability to do these things without Southern Democratic states' rights type of opposition there in Congress. And they're going to do just that. They're going to do just that. It's going to have a huge impact, guys, on period 6. Right? This during the Civil War legislation and pro-industrial advancement to support the war effort moves by the federal government and by industries is going to play a huge role in why we have a massive era of industrialization and economic progress next. But a couple of things to note: they're going to pass a brand new high tariff, which again should not surprise us because Republicans like tariffs, pro-industry type policies. So they're going to a huge tax on imported goods via the tariff, which is a pro-Republican policy. It's lowered after the war, but it's still quite high. They're going to pass a new Homestead Act, which is going to back up that like free soil ideology the Republican Party contains, which is going to basically almost give away giant plots, 160-acre plots of land on the frontier in the West. Using the money from the war to pay for the money from the sales to pay for the war, kind of like the Northwest Ordinances at one point. This makes the free soilers happy, as we know, and it pushes Union ideology out to the West as well. It's also going to lead then to some Indian wars we'll talk about in period 6, as the Native Americans are like, nobody asked us, that's not cool. They're going to pass a new Moral Land Grant Act in 1862, which is going to further the ideas of education in the West. Maybe most importantly, they're going to pass the Pacific Railway Act, which finally puts into motion that transcontinental railroad, which, go figure, caused a lot of this problem in the first place because of the Kansas-Nebraska Act and Douglas's desire for that to go through Illinois. But they're finally going to pass this Pacific Railway Act, which is again going to lead to infrastructure development, which is a pro-Republican belief. And they're going to pass a new National Bank Act and print a bunch of greenbacks, a bunch of paper money to pay for the war effort, to pay for soldiers. So all these things, all these questions, I put a little table in your notes because they're all really important pieces of legislation, are all going to really strongly expand the power of the federal government. Additionally, at the very tail end of the war, they're going to ratify the 13th Amendment, which is going to abolish slavery, which noteworthy as well, and that it also expands the power of the national government, which, as you may recall, the southern states would argue that slavery should be a state's right, a state's decision to decide if slavery was legal there or not. 13th Amendment says, nope, federal government says no slavery anywhere, we're done. So all this stuff, these expansions of government authority are important because this era of expanded federal government authority is just going to continue through Reconstruction in some really meaningful ways. So some political effects that are worth noting as you fill in your table. I don't want you to just copy and paste this. I want you to actually like jot some quick notes. National government supremacy, right? The Civil War finalizes this question about who has supremacy. National government wins. Also political effects, things I've just talked about. Republicans pass a bunch of new laws that are pro-Republican ideology because they are lacking Southern opposition, right, which is largely Democrat and pro-states' rights. Right? The Homestead Act, really important. The Moral Land Grant Act, really important. This new tariff, the Pacific Railway Act, the national banking system, all things that Henry Clay, who's of course dead, would be proud of. But the long-term effect of this is going to really shift the balance of power from, for a long time, Southern dominated because of things like the 3/5 compromise and the electoral college advantage, and the Senate being based on 2 per state as opposed to population based. It's going to shift the political power really from the South to the North, which is why we're going to see a huge era of industrialization. Next, another political effect, abolition of slavery. Abolition of slavery is both a political, a social effect, and as well, obviously, an economic effect. But really, starting early in the war with those confiscation acts I talked about last week, meaning the Union Army could take away, confiscate, to seize any Confederate property in the war effort, which included slaves. That begins the process by freeing slaves. The Emancipation Proclamation we spent a lot of time on last week is going to change the nature of the war, and the 13th Amendment is really going to put an exclamation point on this attempt. Another political effect that I've already talked about, a massive expansion of federal government power. The federal government's going to start using force to enforce policies, using what's called aggressive enforcement, using the power of the federal government, usually the military, to force southern states to comply with federal laws, right? Much like if you think back to nullification, right? The force bill allowing Jackson to use the military to force southern states to pay tariffs. That same kind of idea. The federal government during Reconstruction is going to become, for the first time, a protector of civil rights. Largely, the federal government stays out of these questions of voting and rights and representation and the like up to this point. But the 14th Amendment is going to guarantee citizenship to all African Americans, which is a huge political effect of the war. The federal government's going to take on the first ever social welfare program, a program which is designed just to provide resources and fill needs for people. What's called the Freedmen's Bureau is in your text, one of the most important outcomes of Reconstruction. The federal government's going to start printing currency, paper money for the first time. It's going to conscript or force people into the army for the first time via a draft. So these are all expansions of federal government power that are all really, really consequential. Economically, the North is going to finance the war, pay for the war through what's called government bonds. Right? Government bonds are like short-term loans with the people. Right? The government will sell you a bond for $25 and they'll buy it back in 10 years for $30. So you make $5 and the government has money in the short term. That's how government bonds work. They're going to raise $2.6 billion this way, which can be one of the ways that one of the economic outcomes that fuels industrialization next, a lot of money in circulation. They're also going to raise tariffs to pay for the war. They're going to try new taxes to pay for the war. The first ever temporary, only for the war, income tax is passed to pay for the war. And when that's still not enough, the U.S. Treasury Department is going to start printing paper money. And what that's going to lead to after the war is inflation. Right? There's too much money in circulation because after the war, the economy contracts. There's still a bunch of paper money, and that's going to lead to inflation, which is going to get us to the Panic of 1873, which we'll talk about in our live session. Now, the Northern economy is already modernizing before the Civil War. You remember from period 4, the market revolution, right, in northern cities as they're beginning to embrace their industrial capacity and factory workers and immigrants. That's already happening before the war. The war just speeds that up, right? The war just speeds up the process by which the northern economy is already modernizing. It's an important line. I want to make sure you're clear on that. That if you look at economic growth, it's already happening in the North, and the Civil War happens and then it takes off. So really it's just an accelerator to an already existing process. So the war is going to really accelerate the process by which we become an industrialized nation. Unfortunately, workers' wages in northern cities are not going to keep up with the inflation that comes with this growth. But there is some pro in that because of the war, industries are going to have to modernize themselves and consolidate themselves to really maximize production. And that's going to just continue after the war as well. And of course, in the South, their economic system is destroyed, right? Because their entire system is built on slavery and cotton. Slavery is abolished. And as you know from last week's conversation, the British and French governments have looked elsewhere for their cotton, largely India and Egypt. So even the demand for Southern cotton is also lessened by the war. So in a sense, like if the South had just not left the Union and just said, we're going to hang out here and keep slavery where it is, slavery might have lingered for a long time. And so would have their dominance over the cotton economy. But by seceding, they allow Lincoln to do the things he does during the war, which then leads to the abolition of slavery. So in a sense, that kind of backfired on him. What do you know? Social effects on women, on African Americans, former slaves. Women are going to embrace filling roles for men who are off fighting, working in fields, working in factories, working in offices, working in stores, working even in the government in both the North and the South. Women are going to serve as military nurses in a large number, which is going to, after the war, lead to a huge increase in women serving in the field of nursing. We often look today, in the year of our Lord 2020, at nursing as a largely female-dominated profession, and that process really begins in the Civil War. And we're going to see after the war a new era of fight for equal voting rights for women. Women and African Americans have long been partners on the fight for justice and equality. That's going to actually split here in Reconstruction as African American males get the right to vote and women do not, and thus feel betrayed by their longtime allyship that only yields results for one of them. But the biggest social impact is the abolition of slavery. 3.5 million slaves in the South, 500,000 slaves in the border states are freed via the 13th Amendment. And that's going to be a lot of the questions for Reconstruction is what best to do to support former slaves, to educate former slaves, to give a citizenship and the right to vote to former slaves, et cetera. And so that's important. But we also see a huge social effect on the loss of human life, right? We see 620,000 or so dead men, right? That's a huge generational loss in our nation. The war costs approximately $15 billion in what it costs to actually fight the war and damage property. Slavery is destroyed. The Southern economy is destroyed. So thus it's going to be, as I already talked about, a catalyst that really accelerates the process to a more modernized industrial society. So Reconstruction itself, though, is going to give us, much like the rest of American history does, and APUSH has for you, a political spectrum. Meaning on one side you'll have extremes, and the other side you'll also have extremes. Now on the left side, on the left of Reconstruction, we're going to see the radical Republicans. Right? Thaddeus Stevens, for example, radical Republican. Charles Sumner, homeboy who got beat with the cane, radical Republican. Former slaves that embrace their possibilities to hold office, often radical Republicans, right? And they're going to be over here on the far side of things, arguing for extreme federal supremacy, advocating for full Black equality, Black civil rights, Black voting rights, Black progress, etc., and using the military to force the South to comply, right? Using the military really to punish the South by forcing them to abide by these new restrictions. All right, we're going to see more moderates in the middle. Right, like Lincoln was towards this side, but not as extreme as some others. Right, we're going to see Andrew Johnson, his vice president, soon to be president, on the other side of things, in preferring more states' rights, letting the states decide for themselves who can vote, who can be a citizen, who has rights, etc. Trying to reaffirm former slaves and free Blacks as second-class citizens that don't have the right to vote, own property, etc. And what's called home rule. It's an important phrase. That shows up in a lot of political cartoons from this time. Home rule, meaning get the federal government out of the South, let the South just run themselves the way they want to, which is funny because that's just kind of what got us into this problem in the first place. So this spectrum, right, is going to have extremes on both sides. The far right is going to see the growth of a new movement called the KKK. The far left, with radical Republicans, is going to be arguing for a long-time military occupation of the South, leaving the military in the South to make sure the lesson is learned, so to speak, and this is going to cause incredible conflict during Reconstruction. So we have these questions to answer for Reconstruction. We're going to have to answer all of them this week in our conversation. First, how do we bring the South back into the Union? On what conditions? What do they have to do to, quote unquote, earn their spot back in the country? What requirements should we put on the South in order for them to peacefully re-enter the country? Two, how do we rebuild the South after its destruction? Right, Sherman's march to the sea, the siege of Richmond. Like, so the South, like society and economy and infrastructure is destroyed because of the war. We shouldn't have started it. Three, what do you do about the newly freed slaves? How do you integrate them into society, right, and the economy and politics and society? And the easy answer is like, oh yeah, just give them all equal rights. Sure, right, but keep in mind that one of the conditions of slavery is a limited access to education, right, to knowledge, right? So like, how do you ensure that you integrate them into society while also setting them up for success in society? Because society up to this point has not operated in a way that would provide African Americans of any social class level, slave or free, with any sorts of opportunities that would allow them to be successful, integrated into mainstream white society. And four, who should have a say, right? Should it be the presidency? Should it be the legislative branch that has say over how to answer the rest of these questions? So Lincoln's plan we'll start with first. It really starts during the war, right? As some Confederate states are conquered, namely the first two, Louisiana and Tennessee. The process by which absorbing them back into the Union happens very quickly because they're conquered and thus not fighting the war anymore. So those Reconstruction governments give us a little bit of a blueprint for how Lincoln aimed to deal with Reconstruction. Lincoln argues the entire time that secession was illegal anyway. So like it shouldn't be hard for the South to be let back in the country because technically speaking, according to law, they never really were allowed to leave. But his proclamation in 1863 during the war said any Southerners are forgiven for their crimes if if they take an oath of allegiance, a promise to stay loyal to the country, it's an oath of allegiance, and two, accept that slavery is no longer existing, then that person can be forgiven of their treasonous crimes for trying to fight the country in the Civil War. Forgiven, thus given a full presidential pardon. And this next piece is really important because it's kind of the name of the plan. Once 10% of the voting members in any southern state, once 10% of the voters in a state do this, take an oath of allegiance and accept the end of slavery, once 10% of voters in each state do that, the state can be let back into the Union. Right? So 10% of Alabama, 10% of Mississippi, 10% of Tennessee, whatever, 10% take an oath of allegiance and accept the end of slavery, then they can be let back in the Union. Right? And the only people that are really punished in this case are Confederate officials, anybody who held office in the Confederacy, like that had elected office in the Confederate States of America's national government, and high-ranking military officers. So like people that had military leadership positions that conducted the war. Those two groups of people are not allowed to hold office in the South or vote in the South, right? So he's arguing that like the everyday people of the South aren't why we fought the war. The political and the economic and the military leaders are why we fought the war in the South. So let's punish them and let everybody else back in, call it a day, right? That's Lincoln's proposal. You can make an argument that it's very lenient. It's not very harsh or strict on the South, right? 10% is a pretty low threshold. And the only people that are really being punished are those that had leadership positions. The Republicans in Congress have a different idea that we'll talk about in a second. They're going to pass the Wade-Davis bill, which is going to set the threshold much higher. And Lincoln vetoes it. Lincoln, it's called pocket veto. He lets he lets the legislation expire before saying yes or no, but it's equivalent to a veto. Lincoln vetoes the Wade-Davis bill because he says it's too harsh, right? His philosophy is that malice toward none, charity for all. He says this is not charity for all. This is much too harsh. This is not going to help us put our country back together. It's too much punishment for the South, and thus he vetoes the bill and then backs it up with the second inaugural address with malice toward none, with charity for all. Let us move forward, put the country back together, bind up our wounds, right? And then Lincoln gets shot and killed. You can make an argument that Lincoln being assassinated is actually really, really, really bad for the South, because Lincoln being assassinated allows the more radical version of Republicans, like those in Congress, to seize control of Reconstruction eventually, and in doing so, guarantee things like Black citizenship, Black voting rights, et cetera, in a way that maybe wouldn't have happened with Lincoln as president. Who knows, right? He died. We don't know. So that's Lincoln's proposal. That's Lincoln's proposal. Radical Republicans, if you go back to the threshold, the spectrum, not threshold, the spectrum, these guys over here, like Thaddeus Stevens, Charles Sumner, they're going to argue that this is not enough, right? That what Lincoln's doing is not punishment enough for the South. The South should be punished for trying to secede, right? In a sense, you can think about this like, say, pretend you run away from home, right? And then your parents beg you to come back, right? And you come back and they beat you. Like, why'd you want me to come back if you're just going to beat me for running away, right? So you don't do it again, right? Where one parent might be like, oh, no, we shouldn't punish them because like, we begged them to come back and they've learned their lesson, et cetera, right? So that's kind of the dividing line here between the two. But the radical Republicans think that we should teach the South a lesson for what they did. And their Wade-Davis bill that I talked about, the Lincoln vetoed, requires 50% of Southern state voters to swear an oath to do their promised thing before letting the state back in the Union. Second, no soldier, if you served for one freaking day in the Confederate Army, you can't vote or hold office, right? That you, by serving in the Confederate Army, you committed treason against the United States, and thus we're not going to let you vote or hold office, as well as a guarantee of civil rights, the beginnings of a guarantee for civil rights for African Americans. And as you know, Lincoln vetoes this as too harsh on the South. As you see this great political cartoon here, Lincoln talking to his vice president, Andrew Johnson. So a few more stitches, Andy, and the good old Union will be mended. Good old Union will be mended. And here's Johnson saying, take it quietly, Uncle Abe, and I will draw it closer than ever. In a sense, this is a cartoon that's quite critical of Lincoln for being willing to put things back the way they were when things were broken in the first place due to inequality and the like. So Republicans in Congress are going to disagree with this. They're not going to really have their say for a little bit, but soon they will, and that's the topic of our live session. Now, arguably the biggest success on the ground level of Reconstruction is the Freedmen's Bureau. Now, before his assassination, Lincoln and Congress, the Republicans, are going to establish the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands. Here at the tail end of the war, it becomes colloquially known as the Freedmen's Bureau. That's how we'll refer to it for the rest of the unit in APUSH. You can use it that way in your writing. Freedmen's Bureau is acceptable. But what it's going to provide is really the first social welfare program in American history. It's the first program in which the federal government is saying, we're going to see these people have needs, and the federal government's going to meet their needs. It's going to provide food, shelter, medicine, resources, things people need for both freed blacks that are just freed from slavery and displaced white people. Right? So it's going to help black and white people alike. And white people who've like lost their farms, been displaced, the war has made them flee, right? Whatever it is, like if they need food, shelter, or medicine, they can get it from the Freedmen's Bureau. It's also going to provide for the first time really with black education. It's going to provide black elementary education, the creation of historically black colleges. So it's going to be a really, really impactful social welfare program. So of course, it's going to be viciously attacked and ridiculed by Northern racists who don't want their tax money going to support black progress, and bitter Southerners who are pissed off that they no longer have the full monopoly, if you will, on economic rights and social rights and education and the like, et cetera. So the Freedmen's Bureau, really important, right? It's supposed to serve this purpose, right, as a way to maintain the peace and progress for both races. It instead gets depicted as a unfair advantage being given to Black Americans. If you look at this example of political cartoonery, the Freedmen's Bureau, an agency to keep the Negro in idleness at the expense of the white man, twice vetoed by the president, that's going to be Andrew Johnson, and made a law by Congress. If you support Congress, you support the Negro. Sustain the president, you protect the white man. So it becomes very clear the criticisms of the Freedmen's Bureau as the argument that it just keeps formerly enslaved African Americans in idleness, they don't have to work for anything. It's going to be one of those continued criticisms of Black America that we see during slavery, right after slavery, and then into the future. But the reality for Black Americans on the ground is that it just ending slavery is not enough. Right? Just ending slavery does not, in fact, dramatically change the trajectory of their economic lives, their political lives, nor their social lives. Right? And the system that many Black Americans and oftentimes poor white Americans in the South are going to fall into is what's called sharecropping. Sharecropping is a really important piece of Reconstruction. One of the real downfalls of Reconstruction is the lack of Black ownership of land because of still the plantation style economy, right? In which all the land, all the big land is still owned by those same people, right, who own slaves. But in this case, sharecropping is going to be poor farmers, Black and white. 75% of Black farmers are going to qualify as sharecroppers. So the vast majority of Black farmers are going to have to borrow land from a white landowner. They're going to borrow land and borrow seeds and borrow resources in the hopes that at the end of the year, when they sell all their crop, they'll have enough to pay off their landowner and have some profit for themselves. Now, because farming is the kind of work in which you get paid like once a year, right? Whenever your crop is ready, during the year, the farmer has to buy food and clothing. Who do you buy it from? Your landowner. Now you plant your crops. You have to give half of your crops or whatever percentage is decided upon to the landowner to cover the land you rented, right? And then you sell the rest in the hopes that like you have enough to pay for everything you owe from the food and the clothing you had to buy all year. And when settling up, the landowner says, you owe more than you've earned. Right? So now you're more in debt and have to do it again the next year, and then the debt cycle just continues. Right? Oftentimes, by the time sharecroppers have sold their crops, there's no money left. Right? Unfortunately, many African Americans and poor white farmers are uneducated. They don't know what contracts they sign. They don't understand the economic system of farming because of the limitations on education and progress in the South before the Civil War. And thus, this cycle would continue in which these poor sharecroppers would enter a system that's very much like slavery in that they can't leave because they owe money to this landowner and to keep working on his farm year after year after year to pay off their debts. And in reality, those debts are never going to be paid off. Right. So this is going to lead to the exodusters, which is going to be one cool phrase, the exodusters. If you remember the second book of the Bible, Exodus, is about fleeing. We're going to see some African Americans are going to embrace the Homestead Act and move out to the West for their own plots of land. But the vast majority of African Americans are going to stay in the South and farm because it's really all they know. And there's no real resources or plan put in place to save them from that life. So sharecropping is really important. And reinforcing this idea of Black people staying in a second-class citizen perspective in society is the new president, Andrew Johnson. So as you know, Lincoln is assassinated at the end of the war. His president is Andrew Johnson. Lincoln makes what I think is a pretty big mistake in making Johnson his vice president for a second term, because Johnson is a Democrat. Johnson is only added to the ticket, added as vice president to try to show the South that Lincoln's serious about union and putting things back together. But then Lincoln dies. Johnson's a Jacksonian style Democrat, both in terms of race and in terms of states' rights. So he is the opposite of Lincoln, largely a states' rights Jacksonian Democrat who hates slavery. Don't get me wrong. He hates slavery, but does not hate slavery because it's morally wrong. He hates slavery because he's the anti-aristocrat. He's anti-oligarchy. He's anti the big Southern plantation style slave owners that dominate control over the entire region, because he thinks it's anti-democratic. Right? So he's not anti-slavery on behalf of Black people. He's anti-slavery on behalf of everyday common white folks. Right? He's anti-aristocrat, but he's a strong white supremacist. And he also agrees with Lincoln that the states never really legally left the Union, so we should just let him back in and just move things along. His big phrase that really encompasses his ideology here, so it's really helpful, is the Union as it was, the Constitution as it is. The Union as it was, the Constitution as it is, which means let's put the country back together just the way it was and not use the Constitution. Let's not make any new changes to the Constitution. Look, we ended slavery. That's it. 13th Amendment, done. But there's nothing else that should be done to move society along. Right? The Union as it was, put the country back together. Constitution as it currently is, 13th Amendment, nothing else, to move ourselves along. Right? And when asked, like, what about like the former slaves, what about Black progress? He says, damn the Negroes. I am fighting these traitorous aristocrats, their masters. So it makes it very clear that his philosophy has nothing to do with upholding Black America, but using the presidency to instead attack elite Southern white America. So after Lincoln dies, Johnson ends up being the first president to really oversee Reconstruction, because Lincoln dies a few days after the war. He says his plan is very similar to Lincoln, with one exception. Anybody gets a pardon for their loyalty oath, much like Lincoln's, unless you were a Confederate leader, much like Lincoln, or you owned $20,000 worth of taxable property, which is supposed to really just be targeting the Southern landowning elites. So he makes it very clear that the rich in the South, who he's against, are not allowed to be pardoned and let back into power. He later adds a clause that says, unless you personally come to the White House and ask for forgiveness, because he kind of wants to see these elite Southerners begging for his personal forgiveness. It's pretty vindictive and terrible. But he also proposes that states must abolish slavery and secession clauses from the state constitutions, and they're let back in. Unfortunately, with these loose restrictions on Reconstruction, we see a ton of former Confederates immediately reelected to office. Former Confederate leaders, politically and militarily, are elected right back to office and hold office in Southern states as soon as 1866. And when they take back power, they're going to immediately pass what are called black codes. Black codes. And black codes are really important in that they are going to limit what Black Americans can do, right? Can't be out after dark, can't go to school. They're going to have the crime of vagrancy, which is like homelessness, right? Well, like if slaves lost their home, they have nowhere to live, like how is that a crime on the former slaves' part? So the black codes are going to be enacted immediately after the Civil War under President Johnson's watch. Congress is going to pass a new Civil Rights Act of 1866, a Civil Rights Act to try to provide civil rights and equality for Black Americans. Johnson's going to veto it. Congress is going to renew a new 2-year term of the Freedmen's Bureau. Johnson's going to veto that too. So we see very clearly in Johnson's early presidency the way he views Reconstruction as very clearly the Union as it was, put things right back together the way they were, and move ourselves forward in that way. Right? And this leads us to this pretty great cartoon, which has Thaddeus Stevens representing Congress, staring down Andrew Johnson out with their trains. Right? And it leads to the big showdown for the next 10 years between Congress and the presidency at large, Johnson for now, then Grant, over what to do about Reconstruction as Republicans in Congress are passing important legislation to move the country forward, and Johnson disagrees with that philosophy. So these black codes are really important. Because they're going to be based very similarly on slave codes, right? The things that kept slaves restricted. We talked about slave rebellions, right? Like Nat Turner's Rebellion, et cetera, and how after every slave rebellion, the restrictions on slaves get tighter. Those are slave codes that I'm referring to. Black codes are going to be just like that without the slavery. They're really designed to limit economic opportunity for Black people, right? To try to keep Black people stuck in a situation in which they have to farm for their former plantation owner, so that Southerners don't have to go and pay their labor or find a new labor force. They can go right back to the same style of economy they had with slavery, although without the slavery. For example, forcing Black people in the South to sign annual labor contracts, right? Signing contracts that I have to work here for a whole year, right? That then keeps Southerners stuck to the plantation. Only allowing the occupation of farmer or servant, right? The Black codes are going to say like Black Americans here in this state can only be a farmer or a servant unless they pay a tax. Where are they about to get the money to pay a tax? Like, where does that money come from? They're sharecropping. They're stuck in the cycle of debt. They never have access to liquid capital. How are they going to pay a tax to be anything but a farmer? And who are they going to be a farmer for? Working the farm for a former plantation owner. Restricting their movement, so you can't leave your plantation without permission. Well, that sounds a lot like slavery. Making vagrancy or homelessness a crime. Well, where are they supposed to live? And limiting the types of property that are allowed to be owned, right? That you can't own a store, can't own anything except farmland. Well, where are they about to get farmland in a plantation style economy? Right? Congress is going to pass a law that overturns these Black codes. They say states have no right to do this. The federal government says all these restrictions are illegal. Congress passes this law. Jackson vetoes it. And Congress actually overrides his veto. We talked about this with like nullification and the tariff and then these things. Jackson's war on the bank, right? When Clay and Webster are asking Congress, please, like, give me the 2/3 majority. Let's override his veto. For really one of the first times ever, the House and the Senate get their 2/3 majority in line to override or to cancel out his veto, so the Civil Rights Act still goes into effect, which is really going to set us up towards what happens later in our week and in Reconstruction, as Congress is going to say, sorry, Johnson, we're done with you. We're going to just override all your vetoes and pass a bunch of really important laws anyway. And this is what's going to give us the radical Republicans, right? The far extreme Republicans like Thaddeus Stevens, like our boy Charles Sumner, who's back from the cane beating, last laugh for him. And the radical Republicans are going to look at what Johnson's doing here and what Johnson's allowing to have happen here. It's not that Johnson's passing Black codes. Johnson's just kind of letting it happen and vetoing any attempt to move the country more towards a progressive civil rights direction. The radical Republicans are going to really mobilize their base in the midterm election of 1866. Now, there's a presidential election in 1864 and 1868 every 4 years, but every 2 years, we also re-elect the House of Representatives. Right? There's only 2-year terms. And the midterm election of 1866, the Republicans are going to take a really, really, really smart campaign strategy. They're going to say, not every Democrat was a rebel, meaning seceded. Not every Democrat was a rebel against the country, but every rebel was a Democrat. Therefore, the Democrats are the party of treason, civil war, secession, thus implying you should vote Republican. And their statement's kind of correct, right? There's not every Democrat left the country, but everyone that did was a Democrat. Thus, vote Republican, and that's what happens. In this midterm election, the radical Republicans win a supermajority in the House and the Senate. A supermajority is basically a veto-proof majority because they have 2/3 of the House and 2/3 of the Senate. So they're going to pass whatever bills they want. President Johnson can veto them, and they'll say, too bad. We're going to override your veto because we have the 2/3 majority, so we're going to do whatever the hell we want. In a sense, this means they could pass a law that says President Johnson needs to run around the perimeter of the White House butt naked every morning at 7 a.m. And Johnson's gonna be like, this is ludicrous. I'm not going to sign this law. Veto. And they're going to say, override. Doesn't matter. We have 2/3 majority. And then it becomes law. Right? They don't do this. I kind of wish they had. It would make for a good story. But this is just to demonstrate the power that Congress has with a 2/3 majority that are all Republicans. Math, it matters. This 2/3 majority means they can pass whatever law they want without worrying about Johnson vetoing it because they'll just override that veto. Anyway, right, this then leads to a ton of anti-Republican propaganda, like this piece, right? The voting for Republicans is voting for, they're called the Black Republicans or the pro-Black Republicans. Congress says, at the bottom's a little blurry, Congress says the Negro should be allowed to vote and the states be punished. It's up to you, thus implying vote Democrat. But in these midterm elections, Republicans are going to launch massive campaigns, and they're going to base their campaigns on Johnson's vetoes. They're going to say we're never able to do anything because of freaking President Johnson, this stupid Democrat. Therefore, give the Republicans this big majority, and then we'll move the country forward. Johnson's going to reply with what's called his swing around the circle. He's going to take a train around the country, like spot to spot to spot to spot, and make speeches on behalf of Democrats. But he's really unpopular at this time for what he's done. People are going to boo him and throw fruit at him and whatnot, as they should. And it's going to kind of backfire on Johnson. The Republicans win supermajorities in the House and the Senate by a large margin, and thus are able to really exert our next phase of Reconstruction, phase 3, which is called radical Reconstruction or military Reconstruction. Both of them kind of give you a hint for what's coming. I'll say that for our live session. Have a great day. I can't wait to see you for our last live lecture of the semester. Love y'all.